Instead of the episode title that they gave this one, they probably could have called this one Forced Conflict, the episode. Yes, hello everybody, I'm here to review the latest episode in the Lord of the Rings of Power series, this time episode 4, The Great Wave. And as you could probably already tell from that joke that I made at the top of the video, this was actually the first episode in the series that I found to be deeply disappointing. While I've had issues with previous episodes in this series so far, I've generally been positive on them. They're not 10 out of 10s by any means, but I've generally liked them. This episode is one that I think there is a few things to like within it. I mean, Elrond and Durin continue to be the highlight of the series just overall. Yet, I was ultimately very negative on this one, and a lot of it comes down to what I said before, and just so much forced conflict. I'll go through into some specifics in a second, but just the repeated problem that I saw throughout the entirety of this episode is just characters doing things so that there would be some dramatic moment or some sort of conflict or some sort of like dramatic tension that I ultimately didn't really care about because it was ultimately superfluous. It was just trying to get us either to A to B or just to create some sort of visually interesting thing for us to watch in the middle of the episode. And ultimately, I kind of realized it as I was watching it, and ultimately I'm just sitting here being like, why do I care? This all feels like fluff and ultimately just feels like you're trying to force things to happen to make it seem like something interesting is going on, but ultimately there's nothing really interesting going on. And while the episode ends in a place that has me kind of still intrigued and hooked to see what's going to happen further, this entire episode just felt like narrative running in place or just trying to get us to one point to the other really quickly and as easily as possible without trying to make it logistically follow through or interesting in any way, shape, or form. I have a few other criticisms, but I'll save for when we get into some of the specifics. So let's just get into this thing. Let's start off with the thing that I found to be least intriguing, and that is Bronwyn and Theo's story. We have Bronwyn, who has become like the sort of de facto leader of the men in the Southlands, or the human beings in the Southlands, I should say, because she's no man. And I liked that for her, but she's kind of just thrust into that role when she's like, oh yeah, I said we should go, so now I'm the leader now. And we get this idea that they're all hiding up in this tower that the elves controlled, and they even say that it's like all the men in the entirety of the valley, essentially, is kind of the vibe I'm getting. But it's like, it feels like if that's all those villages living there, I feel like there should be like more people. Like, it doesn't feel like there's enough people to justify like them, like just the extras in that space. Feel like there should be more of them if they're really holding this many people. And I get that in medieval type times, villages were smaller than we think of them now. They would just be a few people, but still I don't know, it just doesn't feel big enough, strangely enough, considering how much money has been put into this show. And that gets even more drawn out for me in a weird way when we see them worrying about food and they have like 5 potatoes. And I'm sure they have like slightly more somewhere else that they are referring to, but I'm just like, this is all the food that you have, and you think like one day of hunting for just a few people will get you enough food. And then Theo presents this idea as like, well, I can go down and sneak in and like steal some food from the larders. And I'm like, okay. So they go and do that, which again is like one quick scene with him and his friend who we've never really seen before. I guess we saw him like a little bit in episode 1, I believe. Going down there to get this food. And they like steal 1 cart full, which again would be helpful, but it's treated at the end of the episode when they do get back like, oh my gosh, they've saved us. Like, we're gonna have enough food to survive. And I'm like, it's 1 cart of food for apparently the entirety of the people in the valley. And I'm like, what? That just the scale of this just did not work for me in any way, shape, or form. But ultimately, that's really kind of beside the point, because really the whole storyline with them needing to get food was ultimately just there, and this is where I'm talking about forced conflict, to get Theo to be in danger. And that was just done to, 1, give us an action sequence where Theo hides from the orcs in the middle of the episode, and 2, to have the orcs figure out that he has this MacGuffin hilt thing, this sort of demon hilt that he had at the beginning of the episode. And I just did not care about Theo being in danger, because I don't care about Theo all that much as a character. He's been kind of like an annoying little kid character throughout most of the show so far. And so I wasn't really worried about him being in danger. And also, it kind of neutered the orcs a little bit. They did such a good job in episode 1 and even slightly in episode 2 making these orcs scary. And here they're just kind of like, they're there. It's fine. So, yeah, that whole story just felt really forced to just have this action sequence and have the orcs learn this piece of information. I'm just like, you could have done it in a smarter way so that it made sense that they were like really needed this food or something like that. And you could have just done something different to make them figure this piece of information out. And so ultimately, I'm just left really frustrated by all of that. The one thing that it did give us was Arondir's cool moment where he grabbed an arrow out of the air. I loved that visually, but ultimately I just kind of found it superfluous and dumb. And speaking of Arondir, I did actually like his scene with Adar, where you were trying to figure out, like, who is this guy? Why do they call you father? Why is he important? I'm very actually intrigued by Adar, but we don't really get much of him. We just get little hints of intrigue with him, which I'm kind of saddened by because that was the most interesting part of this episode, like this orc revering him. I'm really curious to see where this elf sort of sits within this universe and who he's supposed to be. Is he one of, like, the elves that, like, succumb to the rings of power or something like that? Like, I'm just so curious to who he ultimately is. But ultimately we don't get enough to really chew on here for me to really be curious enough. So they focused on really the wrong thing in that entire story. But it does leave me off on the hook where Arondir says, well, the men of the Southlands have been offered a chance to swear fealty. And you get this idea by this, like, strange guy who comes up to Theo at the end, like, have you heard of Sauron? Have you heard of the Lord Savior Sauron? That they might actually take it, because they might be in that dire of a place that they would go back to the Dark Lord, because he's the one actually taking care of them. That's interesting, and I'm curious to see where that's going to go. But to get to that point was just frustratingly stupid. Speaking of frustratingly stupid things, let's talk about Isildur. So Isildur gets kicked out of the Navy, essentially, because he, like, doesn't lift a mast right, and he did it purposefully, and he was doing it to, like, get himself kicked up and out. Just, like, that whole thing with, like, him and his friends, I was like, what? So weird. Like, why would you do that? Why wouldn't you just quit the Navy? Why would you, like, do this whole bit that gets your friends thrown out? Again, it was just, like, this forced conflict to have him, like, have a conflict with his friends, and I don't care about his friends, so whatever. And it leads him to sign up for the army at the end of the episode, which we know will lead Isildur to be in the army alongside his father as they fight Sauron at the in the big battle of Middle-earth that we see at the beginning of the Fellowship of the Ring. So again, it's just trying to get us from A to B in the dumbest way possible, that I'm still intrigued to see where it goes from there, but it just ultimately it makes me feel like, what was the purpose of this episode if that's really all you were going to do, is just have this blah, blah, blah drama and getting us there? I'm sorry I'm being so negative on this, because I do want to talk about some positive. Let me talk about a positive here, because one thing I did like was Elrond and Durin. They continue to be the best thing ever in this show. I do adore them so much. Every scene between the two of them, even if I don't really like the plot around them going on, I love them. Their chemistry is just so much fun. Elrond with Durin's wife, who's Dar, I believe is her name. What did I write it down? Disa is her name. Disa, Durin, and Elrond are great. They have great chemistry. I love the back and forth. I love Elrond trying to figure things out and playing with Disa, and Disa being like, oh, it's fine. You're so funny thinking you've discovered stuff. This is just, you don't understand our Dwarven ways. But then she actually is working with Durin, and then the sexual flirtation between Disa and Durin, I loved. Like, those three and their back and forth with each other, I think is honestly just great. However, that being said, I don't like the storyline that they're in, because it's like Elrond's trying to figure out where Durin is, and there's this, again, a forced conflict where, like, Durin's hiding something from him, but then as soon as Elrond figures out, Durin just reveals it to him, and yes, he's sworn never to tell anybody, and I'm sure that might have some consequences down the line, which would actually be interesting, but it's just like, it just feels like, again, more forced conflict to create conflict for the episode to happen. And it didn't really feel like it came naturally out of anywhere. It honestly would have just been better if he had just been like, well, I didn't trust you because I haven't seen you forever. That would have come out of a conflict that we had seen earlier. Like, Durin still doesn't fully trust Elrond, but here, not really that thing. It's just like, oh, my father didn't want me to tell you. So it's like, oh, okay, that's not coming out of anything organic that we've already seen. It's just sort of a random other thing. It then leads into the reveal that what they're doing is they're mining Mithril. And they have this big moment, it's like, no, it's actually pronounced Mithril in Elven. And I'm like, oh no. They're doing the Star Wars problem, Which the Star Wars problem is that they need to explain, like, the backstory of every little piece of lore within Star Wars. Like, how did Han Solo get his blaster? The answer is, I don't care. and I don't care about how Mithril came to be. It's a metal that exists in this world. Why does it need to have this big deal about it? And again, if there is something interesting being built towards with this, I might be curious. The thing is, possibly for me, it might be that, oh, they're doing this, getting Mithril, and it's going to lead to them uncovering the Balrog that we see in Fellowship of the Ring, because we know that that comes out of Khazad-dûm, because they dug too deep, and that's where they sort of dug up the Balrog. That might be interesting to see. But ultimately it just feels like this sort of like Star Warsian problem of like explaining the backstory of every little thing that I don't really need to know the backstory of. So ultimately I found that frustrating. And then we get this sequence with Durin going to see his father, and there's like a conflict between them, but we've only had one scene with them for all of 2 seconds earlier in episode 2. So I'm like, why do I care about this conflict? And it gets resolved in the only 2 scenes that it gets brought up in. And I'm like, oh, okay, I guess Durin and his father have made up now. Didn't know there was a conflict until last scene, and this next scene, they're together again. So, cool. I feel bad because I'm so down on this episode, but it just has been frustrating because I've liked the series so far, but this one was just not doing it for me. And the one thing I did like seeing is the Numinor sort of falling into the sea vision. And this actually, okay, this I actually do find interesting. Again, it's not played super well within the episode, but I don't hate it as much as I do the other storylines. Number one, cool to see Numinor falling into the sea. I love that being the thing that we all know is going to happen. Like, we do know that that's something that's going to happen. If you know any Middle-earth lore and you know about Numenor, that's like the one thing that you know about it, that it does, spoilers, fall into the sea eventually. And so having them reveal that here and having being like a firm thing, and that they're trying to avoid that, to try and change that history, to like play off of that expectation and sort of like this impending doom, that is interesting to me. I think that's a good choice to play, because it sort of allows the knowledge that us as Lord of the Rings fans, if we already read the books and stuff, know. It allows that to play into the story rather than trying to like play it as a mystery. And having it be about the fall of Numenor's morals was also interesting. We're starting to see that here. We have a quite literally a "they took our jobs" scene in the streets with this guy's like, the elves are gonna come and take our jobs sort of thing. And it does push against like that, like making fun of the South Park thing, but this idea of immigration and people replacing us. And I'm like, that's awesome. That's actually an interesting storyline that's relevant to today while still fitting within this fantasy world. I'm here for that. That's actually a really good storyline. There's not too much done with it within this episode, but that setting up of that as a potential storyline and theme and idea going forward with the Numenorians, I'm here for that. That's a cool concept. The other interesting thing that we got here too was Galadriel not being good at diplomacy and then being taught diplomacy in a very interesting way by Halbrand. I liked Halbrand sort of saying, well, you need to find what the queen fears in order to manipulate her, to master her, is his words. And I love this because, again, it goes to the interesting morality of Halbrand. I've already said that I really think that he's going to be evil, quite potentially being Sauron. A couple other theories that I saw you all in the comments have was that he might be one of the ring race. He might be one of the Nazgul, the men that gets turned into the Nazgul. I think both of those are really interesting theories. I still lean towards, I think it might possibly be Sauron, this idea of him using fear to master and manipulate people. That, I think, is a really Sauron-y thing to do. That's something that Sauron might possibly try to manipulate someone into believing, that they should manipulate people through fear. So him ultimately being revealed to be Sauron, that sort of thing puts us like a point in that column for me. But then again, him being a ring wraith, Nazgul, that also works as well. But just the manipulating factor, I think, fits a Sauron-esque character really, really well. So that has me kind of intrigued. Liked that. But I did like the subversion of Galadriel not using fear and then manipulating fear through that, but actually her finding common ground with the queen because of that fear and actually giving her hope for the future, that they can possibly change that future. I liked that because it showed that while Galadriel was listening to Halbrand, she wasn't necessarily falling into his evil tricks. And it's a very subtle distinction. So all of that I thought was actually really, really good. So yay, I found good things I liked about the episode to find in there. And we also got to see a Palantir, which was also very cool. Yeah, that's pretty much everything. Oh, the guy who said that, have you heard of Sauron? At the end there with Theo, He mentions that he thinks the star was Sauron. Again, I think that's a misdirection. I ultimately think that that's still a wizard. We have over with the Harfoots, either a wizard / Gandalf. And that, again, my pitch that Halbrand is Sauron / possibly a Ringwraith, I think is still going forward. So that's all my thoughts on this episode. Like I said, there are a few things to like, mainly Elrond, Durin, and Disa. Love the three of them. The stuff with Galadriel and Halbrand is intriguing, and Numenor in general is generally intriguing, even if I don't care much about Isildur's story or his sister. I didn't even mention his sister's story. Who cares? Like, I'm sorry, I don't mean to be rude, but, like, who cares about Isildur's sister? Do any of us? I'm not trying to be like, I don't care about the woman character. I love all the women characters elsewhere. Like, Galadriel's great, but I don't care about her. Why is she here? Hopefully they make that relevant in some way, shape, or form. Yeah, that's everything that I had. I hate to be down on this episode. There are some things to like, but overall I found it to be very, very negative, which sucks. I hate being negative. I don't like being a negative person. I don't like making negative reviews, but you gotta be honest, and I gotta be honest about this episode. Didn't like it. That's my thoughts on The Rings of Power, episode 4. I'd love to hear all your thoughts down in the comments below. If you are more positive on this one, please let me know. I'd love to hear that stuff. I don't like being a negative Nancy, so I'd love to hear your positive thoughts and comments and criticisms. But beyond all of that, I hope that all of you, my friends, as always, live long and prosper.